Suffering is often caused by loss. We lose a loved one. We lose health. Maybe we lose freedom, or we lose hope. The larger the loss, the larger the suffering. And such suffering can throw us into a darkness that can cause depression or anger or just confusion. Job is the story of someone who suffered tremendous loss. And the book of Job is famous for the huge problem of suffering and faith. And who hasn't struggled with the dilemma of suffering? Who hasn't asked why bad things happen to good people? And who hasn't asked why certain people go through certain things? And if God is so good, why does this happen? And why does He allow this? And why doesn't He stop it? Is God angry at me? Is He angry at us? Have we done something wrong? Have I done something wrong? How long will this last? What can I do to change this? And so we turn to the book of Job and we think, well, maybe I can find the answers to some of these questions, right? But the story of Job says that the reasons for suffering are often a secret. We can't know. There's no easy formula to make it all add up. There are no easy answers for all the questions that we face in our hardship. Now, I don't have a count, but reading through and having studied the book of Job, there must be 100 or more different questions that are asked just in the text of Job by various people. It's a book of questions. And this makes sense because, you know what? Suffering makes us question, doesn't it? And many times it makes us question God. The first two chapters are key to the book of Job because they set up the story. Now, Job is a part of a group of books in the Hebrew Scriptures that are called the poetry books or the writings. They're not stories of history, but they're poetry, they're prayers, they're proverbs, they're songs, musings that speak about life and speak about God. We don't know who wrote Job exactly. We're not exactly sure when it was written. I think of Job as indeed a real person who goes through a horrific experience, and that experience perhaps led someone to write this based on him. It is not written as people actually speak. No one spoke or speaks as they do in the book of Job. It's written in poetic language. Job, think of it like a stage play, kind of an opera on his life. And Job is introduced to us as a man who is, as it says at the beginning, he is blameless and upright, who feared God and shunned evil. And his wealth, his great wealth, is seen as a sign of his goodness before God. He is called the greatest of all the people in the East. He is so godly that he makes special sacrifices for his children just in case they do something wrong. Job takes spiritual responsibility for his children and their standing before God. One day, Satan shows up before the Lord. By the way, the name Satan means adversary. And for reasons only known to the storyteller, you might say, the Lord points out Job to Satan, spotlighting him for how upright he is. And we can't explain why the Lord would even do this, but remember, it's a story with a larger point. And Satan is convinced that the only reason that Job walks with God is because God has blessed him and protected him. Take that hedge of protection away, and Satan is convinced Job will curse God to his face, and he'll lose his faith. The plot of Job is really, it's a bet. It's a challenge. Job doesn't so much explain suffering or even tell us how to deal with the suffering we face. The big plot of Job is the question. Now, will Job curse God and turn from God when things go bad for him? Does he only love God as long as he's prosperous and things are easy for him? Will he sin by turning from God? Things go really bad for Job. He suffers unspeakable and tragic loss. One wave of tragedy after another comes to Job as one messenger after another comes and informs him of his latest loss. Oxen, servants, his very family are taken from him. And the suddenness of it is emphasized by the repeated phrase, while he was still speaking. And while one messenger is speaking, another messenger comes and tells him what he's lost. And as that messenger speaking, yet another one comes and tells him what he's lost. All the bad news. And after all Job's possessions and family are lost, the Lord allows Satan to afflict Job's health. Well, Job's wife says, why don't you just curse God and get it over with? But Job says this, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Shall we accept only good from God and not trouble? Well, folks, you can write that down and meditate on that one all week, that question. Should we only want God when it's good and not when we have trouble too? Boy, that's a question we can ponder all our life. It is a key question of faith. It is a question of spirituality. It is the question of the book of Job. Now, Job has three friends: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. Those names, and particularly that last one, Zophar the Naamathite, they always remind me of pharmaceuticals or medications. Have you taken your Zophar today? Oh, yes, I'm feeling much better. Thank you. Well, anyway, these three friends come and they sit with Job in his suffering. And the rest of the book is kind of like an opera. These various characters take the stage and they speak their parts. And it begins with Job cursing the day that he was born and cursing his very existence. He wants to know why he just didn't die at birth so he wouldn't have to go through all this miserable suffering. Now, he doesn't curse God, just his life. And this begins a cycle now where each of those three friends of Job respond with explanations for his suffering. And then Job answers them each time. In his introduction to the book of Job in The Message, Eugene Peterson writes this: sufferers attract fixers like roadkill attracts vultures. Job's friends want to fix him. He's suffering and they've got the answer for it. They want to straighten him out, get him thinking right about his situation. And each friend presents the reason for why Job is in the situation that he is in. And they basically conclude, Job, you've done something wrong. Obviously, he sinned against God, and thus the Lord is bringing this upon him. In the Old Testament times, the thought was, if things are good and you're prosperous, then you're doing good before God. If trouble comes to you, then you've done something wrong against God, and he's punishing you. The bulk of the book of Job is this back and forth now between Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, all taking their shots, and then Job responding that he is innocent. And not only does Job take on his three friends, and with friends like this, who needs comforting you, who needs enemies, right? But Job questions the Lord. He never curses or turns on God, but man, he questions him because Job is not happy, and who can blame him? For example, in chapter 7, he asks God, why have you made me your target? Have I become a burden to you? In chapters 9 and 10, he speaks of loathing his life. He says, I will give free rein to my complaint. I'm going to speak out the bitterness that's in my soul. And so he does. Job wants to know why the Lord counts him as an enemy. And isn't that how we feel when we suffer deeply and things are going against us? We ask, is God even on my side? And throughout all this back and forth, Job maintains his integrity. And he also maintains that he has no explanations for his suffering, but he never curses God. Now in chapter 32, a new person takes the stage. His name is Elihu, who apparently has been listening in this whole conversation, but because he is younger, he says he has allowed his elders to speak, the three pharmaceuticals. And Elihu burns with anger at Job, and he accuses Job of justifying himself before God. And he burns with anger at Job's three friends for what they're saying, because they don't know the answer to the whole situation. And so Elihu enters the stage to set everyone straight. And his theology is that God sends suffering upon people to make them admit they're wrong and repent and turn back to him. And he accuses Job of being conceited and wise in his own eyes, while what Job should be doing is admitting his wrong before God. Enter the Lord. Chapter 38. God begins to speak. And he speaks first to Job. And he says, brace yourself like a man. I will question you and you're going to answer me. He's not mad. He's just saying, I'm going to ask you some questions. And the Lord fires question after question after question to Job, really never letting him respond. Questions like, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Have you commanded the morning to come every day since the beginning of time? Can you send forth lightnings? Is it by your understanding that the hawk can fly and spread his wings? Shall a fault finder like you contend with the Almighty? In other words, Job, who are you? Are you the Lord? Do you really have all this understanding? And the Lord just heaps challenging questions upon Job. And the book ends with Job making a deep confession of faith. And this is what Job admits. He says, God can do all things and anything he wants to. And that Job was speaking of things he really didn't understand, and now he has experienced God in a new way, having now seen the Lord who he had previously only heard about. And he realizes his own foolishness, and he repents. And then the Lord chastises those three friends. For whatever reason, Elihu is not mentioned, but he tells those three friends, he says, you know what, everything you said to Job was wrong, while all that Job has said about the Lord was right. Job is vindicated by God. And the Lord tells these three friends to go make sacrifices to become right with God and have Job pray for them, because the Lord will listen to Job's prayer. And the Lord restores the fortunes of Job more than he had before. And Job goes on to live a full and a blessed life for the rest of his days. Read all 42 chapters of Job, and we never really get an answer to the question of why suffering. What we get is an answer to who. There's no why, but we get who. Because what we get is a vision and a picture of the Lord. Job is able to see through his suffering to God. And in one of the best-known passages in Job, he says this, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at the end he will stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. In other words, even if I die, my end will be with God. And he says, but God knows the way that I take when he has tested me, and I will come forth from this time as good as gold. In other words, I don't know the reasons why God does what he does, but he's purifying me. There are many things we don't. There are many things we can't, that we will never understand about our suffering and the suffering of others in this life. But if we can see through it all to God, we can come to a place of trust and rest, even as we wonder, even as we continue to wonder. As you read Job, pay attention to what it says about God, the who, not the why, the who. Here's what I believe Job teaches us. Number one, Job isn't a book about suffering as much as it's a book about faith. The book doesn't answer where is God when it hurts. The point of the book is how is Job responding, and will he hold on to the Lord through his trials? And Job questions God, but he never quits on God. And at one point Job says, even if he kills me, yet I'm going to hope in him. Even if God takes my life, I'm going to keep trusting in him. That is a profound affirmation of faith that can only be said by people who have a faith that is more than just giving a little time on an occasional Sunday morning. When sorrow upon sorrow comes, it is so natural, it is so easy to believe that God has forgotten us. Walter Ciszek was a Jesuit priest, and he wrote about the darkness and the exhaustion and the despair that came upon him many years ago when he was in a Soviet labor camp. And he had been arrested for doing clandestine missionary work. And he was interrogated for weeks as he was pressed to cooperate with the Communist Party. And in his resistance, he said, I had lost the last shreds of my faith in God. I knew I had to seek immediately the God I had forgotten. And he thought about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Ciszek was changed, and he realized all he could do was abandon himself into the hands and the will of his Father. And he said, what he wanted for me was to accept these situations from his hands, to let go of the reins and place myself entirely at his disposal. It was the grace that God had been offering me all my life, but which I had never really had the courage to fully accept. Job is about keeping faith amidst the trials, the difficulties, the hardships that we face, even when we struggle to understand. Second thing I think Job teaches us is that it's okay to protest. It's okay to not like what we face or what we are going through. We can be honest with our feelings with God. Elizabeth Elliot lost her husband, killed in Ecuador by the very people that they went to be missionaries to share the good news of God's love, and then she lost a second husband to cancer. And she wrote in her book, A Path Through Suffering, that Job showed his faith because he kept talking to God. Oh, he was upset. He was frustrated with God. He was mad at God, but he kept the conversation going. If you know someone who is mad at God and who is questioning him, don't think it's necessarily bad. At least they're keeping the conversation going. You know, people speak of the patience of Job. Oh, he's got the patience of Job. That phrase comes from a reference in the 5th chapter of the New Testament letter of James. The word really means to persevere, to be steadfast or enduring. It's older versions of the Bible that speak of Job as being patient. Hey, Job was not really patient. He voiced his opposition and he struggled with God quite loudly. He didn't just sit back and accept it. Better to take our protests to God than turn our backs on him. Better to take our outrage and our brokenhearted cries to him. That can actually be a sign of trust. It's actually showing we're taking God very seriously. Last thing, third thing, Job teaches us to be aware of religious formulas and easy answers to suffering. I think the book of Job rejects any advice or teaching that God has, that we have God all figured out. Sometimes tragedy hits, or we suffer a loss, or something just really hard happens, and we don't know why, and there is no explanation. And that's part of living by faith. Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, Elihu, they try to explain Job's loss and pain in ways that they think God, they have them all figured out. And their formula is, well, if bad is happening to you, God is mad at you. If good's happening to you, then God really likes you. And they find out they were wrong. You know, the coming of Jesus clarified the mind and the heart of God. One time his disciples saw a blind man, and they asked Jesus, okay, who did it wrong, him or his parents? And Jesus said, nobody did anything wrong. He says this man is blind to show the glory of God, and Jesus went on to heal him. And there was a larger purpose happening in all of that. We go on to read John chapter 9 about that story, and we see that the man's blindness was to help others see who Jesus is. When people hurt, they usually don't need an explanation. What they need is what Paul says, what he writes when he says, they need someone to weep with those who weep. And we are to bear the burdens of others in fulfillment of the command to love others. Usually what people need is they need presence and love and the comfort more than just talking or easy explanations. Most of the time we don't get to choose if or how we will suffer. We do get to choose how we will respond. Job had incredible freedom in how he could respond to his suffering, and Job ultimately found his meaning in the indefinable, indescribable presence of God. He couldn't fully comprehend it with his intellect. He could only experience it in the depths of his very being. And the story is given to us to keep faith, to keep perseverance, to keep our eyes on God, trusting Him, even when trusting Him is the very hardest thing to do. Amen. Let's stand and let's sing.